Hi, I'm Haley B. Miller, and this is Ohio Politics Explained, a podcast where you give us 15 minutes and we give you all the news you need to sound smart and impress your friends. Welcome to another episode of Ohio Politics Explained. Today, we're talking about Governor Mike DeWine's proposed budget. I promise it's interesting. Larry Householder's appeal, a bill that would change rules for underage drinking, and the musical chairs of the 2026 election. With me today is Jesse Balmer.
Thanks for having me.
So, it's budget season. DeWine unveiled his plan for 2026 to 27 this week, and spoiler alert, a lot of it has to do with kids. He wants to create a child tax credit for people with young children and spend $50 million to help kids who need glasses. DeWine also made sports bettors and smokers mad. His proposal would make cigarettes more expensive to pay for the tax credit and increase the sports gaming tax to cover stadium projects and youth sports. What else is DeWine hoping to do for his final budget?
Yeah, there's so much in there. As far as school funding, he wants to continue to phase in this Cupp-Patterson school funding plan that was pitched a few years ago. That there's been a lot of discussion from Speaker Matt Huffman about him saying that that is a fantasy or unsustainable. So I think you can tee that up for a fight during the budget season. There was a bunch of things dealing with higher education, some ideas like tying how much universities and community colleges get in funding to whether their graduates are employed, not just whether they graduate or complete courses and certificates, but did they get a job? But like you said, I think the big focus is going to be on these quote unquote sin taxes, raising taxes on marijuana and tobacco and sports betting to pay for things like youth sports or different stadium for the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, and speaking of marijuana, DeWine's proposed tax rate for that would go up to 20%. It's currently 10% right now, and DeWine's proposal is even higher than the 15% tax that Senate Republicans have proposed for marijuana. So we'll see what the final number is, but there's definitely an interest in taxing recreational marijuana products more, which people are already still going to Michigan, and I don't think that'll help.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not what Ohioans voted for when they voted to legalize marijuana in 2023. And so the question is, did people vote just on the concept of, yes, we would like to be able to grow and purchase marijuana in Ohio, or were they really looking at the details? Did they really like what was being put forward here? I think a lot of lawmakers in DeWine are saying like, no, we have a lot of room to tweak this, but how upset will the people who voted for this pretty overwhelmingly be about those changes?
Right. So this is just the beginning of the budget process. Really, lawmakers are going to spend the next several months hashing things out. It remains to be seen how much of DeWine's ideas will be in the final product. But given that I mentioned this is his last budget because he's term limited, he won't be governor in a couple of years, how do you think that's going to affect negotiations and perhaps his willingness to fight harder for things he wants?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's probably going to double down on the things like the child tax credit, for example, or, money for things like literacy, making sure that this whole shift towards the science of reading is really enforced and taught in Ohio's schools. I think he came up with some interesting ways to fund these things. And I know his previous tax proposals have not ended up in the final product. So I think you could see a lot of that changing. It'll be really interesting whether the lawmakers are going to push for an income tax cut as they have basically every budget since I've been here. That wasn't part of DeWine's proposal. He has basically said when he's talking to businesses about coming to Ohio, the income tax level is not something that's dissuading them from coming to the state. So we shall see, but this all must be done by June 30th. That is your final deadline for a balanced, constitutionally required state budget.
Our next topic is Larry Householder. An appeals court heard arguments this week over whether the former Ohio House Speaker should stay in prison. As a reminder, Householder is serving a 20-year sentence for orchestrating Ohio's biggest public corruption scheme. That's what the prosecutors believe, anyway. Why does Householder and his defense think that this racketeering conviction should be tossed?
Yeah, so they approached it from a bunch of different ways, and some were a little bit more technical. Things like there was a juror who was dismissed after this person wouldn't get a COVID-19 test and didn't want to wear a mask, and someone else on the jury had already tested positive, and they took issue with like how the judge did that. Did the judge have a communication with this juror outside of the attorneys being able to question it? The appeals court judges were kind of like, I don't know, people get sick, and I don't know how involved everyone needs to be in that. So there are technical things like that. Whether the federal judge who oversaw this case, Judge Black, should have either allowed more evidence in or allowed less evidence in. Like, there are two people who testified in the case who pleaded guilty to racketeering. Is that information that the jury should have known? So a few of those things were more technical. But the big question is, where is the legal line between a legal campaign contribution and an illegal pay-to-play scheme? And how much of like an explicit, yes, I am taking this money in order to pass a bailout bill for these nuclear plants that directly benefits this company that's giving me millions of dollars, did there have to be?
One other interesting thing we learned this week is that, at least for now, Householder and his attorney aren't planning to seek clemency from President Donald Trump. That was kind of an open question when Trump won the election, but they seem pretty confident in their appeal argument. I guess we'll find out if that holds water.
Yeah, that was something I talked to one of his attorneys, not his criminal attorney, after the case, and said that right now they're not going to pursue clemency from President Donald Trump. It was kind of a question as to how successful that would be anyway, but certainly he had a better shot with Trump than with former President Joe Biden.
Former Ohio GOP chair Matt Borges, who was also convicted and sentenced, though his prison sentence is not as long, he's also appealing. Where are things at with him?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. His argument all along has really been like, I barely went here. Like, I was barely involved in this whole situation. And the judges kind of pushed back a little bit on that if Borges was part of the conspiracy, no matter how much he participated in it, you can still get in trouble for being part of the overall scheme. And so that's interesting. There's been a lot of pushback against this $15,000 bribe that Borges provided to a political operative, Tyler Furman, in exchange for information about how many signatures had been collected to block House Bill 6, this bailout bill. And you know, if that information was going to be public eventually, how valuable really was it? But I think most people know that when you're trying to get on the ballot, exactly where you are is important information.
Yeah, House Bill 6, the saga that never ends.
I've been covering it since 2019, and we have new people recently indicted on the first energy front, so it'll be a while.
Let's pivot to the 2026 election, another saga that may never end. Two Ohio Republicans made moves this week to set the stage for next year, when voters will choose a new governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and more. Treasurer Robert Sprague surprised us and announced that he will run for secretary of state. Sprague had been eyeing the governor's mansion, but he perhaps saw the writing on the wall and endorsed Vivek Ramaswamy instead. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Frank LaRose revealed his next steps, a run for state auditor. It seems like Ohio's statewide officials are just gonna switch jobs.
Yeah, you know, when nearly all of your statewide office holders are Republican and all of them are going to be term limited at the same time, we're going to do just a lot of moving around. It's interesting. The governor's race is really becoming a two-person race between Vivek Ramaswamy, as you mentioned, who was a former presidential candidate and was an appointee to this Doge with Elon Musk that's getting a lot of attention right now for government efficiency and so forth in DC. Him versus Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, who has been eyeing this job for probably quite longer. So that has been interesting. There's just been like really a slew of support that's moving in Ramaswamy's direction, whether that be Robert Sprague or, you know, various senators from across the country endorsing Vivek, who hasn't actually officially gotten the race yet. So that'll be interesting. But yeah, Frank LaRose running for auditor. He was someone who ran for U.S. Senate and came in third in that GOP primary. I think it was pretty widely reported that he was interested in some sort of federal appointment. And so auditor certainly wasn't the first job on his list, but the one that he is going to pursue going forward.
Yeah. And, Ramaswamy's bid for governor, I think, is going to be really interesting. Like I said, Sprague had been eyeing this job, but early polls are showing that Ramaswamy has a pretty commanding lead. And while we still have a year until the primary, I think he certainly starts with a leg up. He has a lot of money. He hired Vice President J.D. Vance's closest political advisors, and he has a ton of name recognition for his presidential run, for being a close ally of Trump, and he's willing to kind of go places that politicians traditionally aren't in terms of interviews or things like that.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing this more and more, both nationally in Ohio, obviously President Donald Trump being the prime example of someone who didn't have political experience prior to getting, the most important job in the country. And then, but we also have J.D. Vance, who was an author and entrepreneur prior to winning the Senate seat. Bernie Moreno had not had political office before he became our U.S. Senator. So there really is this, we're not going to wait in line feeling among Republicans in particular, candidates for these big spots.
Yeah. Our final topic today is underage drinking. House lawmakers want to crack down on parents who allow teens to drink at parties. The bill only changes one word in state law. It would be illegal to recklessly allow anyone under 21 to possess or drink alcohol instead of knowingly. Basically, that would make a violation easier to prosecute. What's the story behind this?
Yeah, I think it's from a couple of Republican lawmakers who are concerned about underage drinking generally and just how accessible it can be. There was also a tragedy a few years ago with the kid who died because in relation to some underage drinking. And so it's accountability for kind of the parents and the community in addition to the individual actually involved. I think you're seeing this move more towards parental involvement on a variety of issues, whether that be where you're going to school or, even higher education. So this kind of accountability of parents for your children has been a theme, the State House as of late.
Yeah, I wasn't really aware of any sort of prevalence of parents just letting their kids do whatever, drink whatever, but I'm not, exactly clued into what it's like to have a teenager right now.
Not being a teenager, but a few years ago, this never would have flown in the Ballmer household for sure.
And one more thing before you go. If you're having a hard time getting in touch with Ohio's new senators, you aren't alone. The offices of Bernie Moreno and John Husted are getting a ton of calls amid the Trump cabinet confirmation hearings. It's a Senate-wide issue, and IT staff are working to expand their servers so calls actually get through.
Yeah, I think you should check out Haley's story on this, on how to best communicate with the new senators. But these offices handle a lot of things, whether that be your passport got caught up or, just other ways you're trying to get a tour at the White House or something. So obviously there's a lot of concerns about policies and things happening in Washington right now, but there's also just practical applications for being able to get a hold of these folks.